Hello and welcome to the Watch Juno. In today's video, we're diving deep into the top 10 federal gun laws passed in the last 100 years that many believe pose a serious threat to our Second Amendment rights. Gun owners and rights advocates have raised concerns about the increasing number of federal regulations that over time could lead to even more restrictive laws. Let's take a closer look at the most notable regulations that continue to impact gun ownership in America. 1. National Firearms Act, 1934. Our first law on the list is the National Firearms Act of 1934. This law was one of the first major federal infringements on the Second Amendment. It imposed taxes and strict regulations on certain firearms, including machine guns, short-barreled rifles, and suppressors. The NFA was introduced in response to the rise of organized crime during the Prohibition era, with the goal of restricting access to these types of firearms. However, gun rights advocates view it as a significant step toward the government controlling and limiting firearm ownership. The NFA created a system of registration, background checks, and hefty taxes that made it increasingly difficult for law-abiding citizens to own certain firearms. 2. Federal Firearms Act, 1938. Next up is the Federal Firearms Act of 1938, which laid the groundwork for modern firearm regulations. This law required gun dealers to obtain a federal license and keep detailed records of all gun sales. It also prohibited the sale of firearms to certain individuals, including convicted felons. While the intent behind the law was to regulate the sale of firearms and reduce crime, it marked a significant shift toward federal control over who could lawfully possess a firearm. Critics argue that it set a dangerous precedent for future gun control measures, effectively establishing the federal government as the gatekeeper for firearm ownership. 3. Gun Control Act, 1968. The Gun Control Act of 1968 is one of the most well-known federal regulations that further expanded government control over firearms. This law was passed in the wake of the tragic assassinations of prominent figures like John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy. The GCA introduced several new measures, including federal licensing for gun dealers, record-keeping requirements, and restrictions on interstate gun sales. Additionally, it prohibited individuals with certain criminal records or mental health issues from owning firearms. While the GCA was aimed at improving public safety, it raised concerns about the expanding power of the federal government in regulating gun ownership. 4. Firearm Owners Protection Act, 1986. The Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, or FOPE, is often seen as a mixed bag. While it included provisions that protected gun owners, it also introduced a significant restriction. The FOPA prohibited civilians from owning new fully automatic weapons manufactured after May 19, 1986. For many gun rights advocates, this was a major blow to the Second Amendment, as it essentially froze the civilian market for automatic firearms. Although it preserved the ownership of previously acquired fully automatic weapons, the law set a dangerous precedent by restricting civilian access to certain types of firearms. It's often cited as an example of how a seemingly protective law can also limit gun rights. 5. Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, 1993. In 1993, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act was signed into law, marking another major shift in federal gun regulations. This law created the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, NICS, requiring background checks for most firearm purchases made through licensed dealers. While background checks are often seen as a necessary measure to prevent criminals from obtaining firearms, critics argue that the Brady Act complicates lawful gun ownership and creates unnecessary barriers for law-abiding citizens. The law also sparked debates about the expansion of government databases and the potential for future infringements on the right to bear arms. 6. Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, 1994. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 is perhaps best known for its assault weapons ban, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of certain semi-automatic firearms and high-capacity magazines. Although the ban expired in 2004, it remains a point of contention among gun rights advocates. Many view the ban as an overreach that unfairly targeted certain types of firearms, while others argue that it was a necessary measure to curb violent crime. Regardless of where you stand, the assault weapons ban set a precedent for future efforts to restrict access to certain firearms and magazines. The debate over its effectiveness and potential reinstatement continues to this day. 7. Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, 1968. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 introduced several important provisions, including raising the minimum age for purchasing handguns from federally licensed dealers to 21. While the intent behind this provision was to reduce gun violence, critics argue that it discriminates against young adults who are lawfully allowed to vote, serve in the military, and make other important life decisions. By raising the minimum age for handgun purchases, the law effectively denied young adults the right to purchase firearms, despite their ability to lawfully own them under state law. This regulation sparked debates about age-based discrimination and the fairness of restricting gun ownership for a specific age group. 8. Bump Stock Ban, 2018. Following the tragic 2017 Las Vegas shooting, the Trump administration took swift action by issuing an executive order to ban bump stocks, which are devices that allow semi-automatic rifles to fire more rapidly. The reclassification of bump stocks as machine guns under the National Firearms Act effectively banned their possession and sale. While many gun rights advocates view this as a necessary step to curb gun violence, others argue that it was an overreach by the executive branch. The bump stock ban raised concerns about the potential for future regulations targeting other firearm accessories and modifications, setting a dangerous precedent for further restrictions on gun ownership. 9. Gun-Free School Zones Act, 1990. The Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 made it a federal crime to possess a firearm within 1,000 feet of a school, with certain exceptions for law enforcement officers and individuals with concealed carry permits. While the law aimed to increase safety around schools, many gun rights advocates argue that it created soft targets for criminals and hindered the ability of law-abiding citizens to defend themselves. Critics also contend that the law infringes on the Second Amendment by restricting gun ownership in public spaces. Despite its intent to protect students, the law has been criticized for limiting the rights of responsible gun owners. 10. Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, 2022. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022 was passed in response to a series of high-profile mass shootings. Among its provisions, the law expanded background checks for gun buyers under the age of 21, provided funding for state red flag laws, and restricted firearm purchases for individuals convicted of domestic violence offenses. While supporters argue that the law will help reduce gun violence, critics contend that it encroaches on due process rights and could lead to further restrictions on gun ownership. The expansion of background checks and the implementation of red flag laws have raised concerns about potential abuses and the erosion of Second Amendment protections. These 10 federal gun laws have played a significant role in shaping gun ownership in the US. While some aim to enhance safety, many are seen as infringements on the Second Amendment. As more regulations are introduced, it's crucial to remain vigilant and informed about how these laws could impact our rights. Now, here are 3 questions to test your understanding of the federal gun laws we've discussed. Question 1. Which federal law passed in 1934 imposed taxes and regulations on firearms like machine guns and suppressors, marking one of the first major infringements on Second Amendment rights? Question number 2. How did the Gun Control Act of 1968 impact gun ownership for individuals with certain criminal records or mental health issues, and what restrictions did it impose? Question number 3. What was the primary purpose of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022, and how did it expand background checks and address red flag laws? If you found this video informative, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future content. Stay informed, stay safe, and as always, thank you for watching.